North Atlantic, March 1943. The ocean was black glass, restless and infinite. Its surface rose in heavy swells that swallowed the horizon, then fell again into silence. Somewhere below that dark skin moved 20 merchant ships, 60,000 tons of steel and cargo in convoy HX-229, engines thudding under overcast sky. Their navigation lights were extinguished. Only the stars and the hushed discipline of sailors guided them through waters known to claim thousands. Each man could feel the proximity of unseen hunters beneath. Through fog and snow, destroyers cut narrow paths, radar antennas spinning steadily. Sonar pulses whispered from their hulls, clean echoes returning, but no danger yet. Inside a German U-boat 200 feet below, crewmen strained to listen through headphones, expecting the solitary beat of a victim's propellers. Instead, they heard nothing but static and the deep rhythmic churn of the sea. When dawn approached, the convoy still lived. Not a single ship lost. Above those exhausted watch crews stretched a gray horizon lined with vapor trails from long-range liberators, the newest guardians of the Atlantic Gap. For submariners who once ruled these waters, disbelief replaced confidence. The Americans had crossed a killing zone and left no graves behind. The question no one could answer yet was how. What unseen network of inventions, strategies, and code breakers had turned the deadliest ocean into safe passage? At the start of the Atlantic campaign, the rhythm of war at sea favored the hunter. From 1939 onward, Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarine fleet had expanded quietly from a handful of worn Type 7 boats to a disciplined arm of the Kriegsmarine. Their mission was simple and merciless: starve Britain. No ships meant no fuel, no food, and no invasion force ever crossing back to Europe. By 1940, the equation was working. Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the gray wolves of the Atlantic prowled along convoy routes, sinking 2.6 million tons of Allied shipping in 1 year. British life depended on imports from North America: grain, oil, munitions, and the Royal Navy simply lacked enough escorts. Each sinking sent tremors through British morale. In London's war rooms, walls of charts filled with pins marking ships lost, a constellation of disaster migrating westward by the week. The first happy time for U-boats lasted through 1941. German crews cruised the mid-Atlantic with near impunity. Radar was crude, sonar unreliable, and aerial coverage existed only close to shore. Convoys were forced to rendezvous in the very gap where no air patrols could reach, a void stretching 500 miles wide. Here, U-boats waited like wolves in dark water, submerging by day, attacking by night, with torpedoes streaking beneath phosphorescent waves. Merchant sailors described the experience as living inside a target. No armor, no weapons, just the hope that a destroyer's flares might reveal the assailant. The Battle of the Atlantic was, by any measurement, not just a fight for sea lanes. It was the oxygen line of the entire Allied cause. Every victory on land, from the deserts of North Africa to the skies over England, was fed by the convoys these men steered through hell. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Atlantic's balance shifted only in mathematics, not in safety. A deluge of new cargo ships joined the perilous routes, increasing volume but also providing fresh targets. In early 1942, as America mobilized, German U-boats sailed west and devastated the unprotected eastern coast. Over 600 ships burned or sank in sight of U.S. beaches during the second happy time. The skyline of New York glimmered as navigational backdrop for torpedo attacks. Even the Hudson carried oil slicks to shore. Yet within Washington's Naval Operations Building, a transformation was accelerating. American industry had awakened to the logistics war. Yards at Baltimore, New Orleans, and Richmond assembled Liberty ships faster than submarines could claim them. Training facilities turned novice sailors into competent sonar operators. Task forces under Admiral King began studying British methods and improving them with American resources. Longer-range destroyer escorts, improved depth-charge throwers, magnetic detonators, and radio detection technology known as Huff-Duff. Beneath the momentum, another secret effort was unfolding: the Allied cryptanalytic triumph at Bletchley Park, where ultra-intercepts began decrypting Enigma messages from U-boat command. Through those translations, the Allies tracked patrol groups weeks ahead, rerouting convoys into safer corridors. The Germans never suspected how often their own encoded signals guided Allied evasion instead of destruction. By winter 1942, the first signs of a coming reversal appeared. Fewer ships vanished. Kill rates declined, but the ocean was wide and the wolf packs were still deadly. Over 100 submarines prowled its breadth each month. The Americans would need nothing less than perfect synergy of technology, industry, and human nerve to turn the tide. And that turning point would emerge not in high command offices, but in the cold, shifting gap between Newfoundland and Iceland, where men measured victory by the number of merchant wakes still visible at sunrise. That gap, soon filled by radar beams, codebreakers, and long-range defenders, would become the graveyard of the German U-boat arm itself. Through the harsh winter of 1942-43, the Atlantic convoys transformed from floating targets into floating laboratories. Every route, every escort pattern, and every frequency emitted from a ship's radio became data-fed into an evolving system. The United States Navy had always favored material solutions: build, refine, repeat. But here, hardware met doctrine in real time. A convoy now moved like an organism, reactive and self-aware. At the heart of this restructuring stood the convoy escort. Each group usually included a mix of destroyers, corvettes, and sometimes a newly commissioned escort carrier. The Americans called them jeep carriers, small decks with just enough runway for Wildcats and Avengers fitted with depth charges. They carried the air power that once stopped at the coastline, the protection gap that had fed U-boat success. The void once known simply as the Black Pit was closing. In January 1943, codebreakers at Bletchley Park decrypted orders revealing the planned convergence of 6 German wolf packs against a convoy bound for Britain. The information traveled through an intricate chain of custody, from British analysts to the U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet, its first headquarters dedicated solely to anti-submarine warfare. 10th Fleet rerouted the convoy. The U-boats found only empty sea. The hunters, hours from their intended ambush, surfaced into mist and confusion. To Berlin's disbelief, reports came back of enormous Allied traffic in the mid-Atlantic and 0 kills. Dönitz demanded explanations that no captain could provide. At the technical level, Victory's framework was invisible. High-frequency direction finding stations, Huff-Duff, sprouted along the American coast and North Atlantic outposts, triangulating submarine transmissions within seconds. For decades, navies had relied on the eye and the periscope. Now, invisible waves drew maps through fog and night. A U-boat surfacing to contact headquarters instantly betrayed its position. Equally decisive was radar miniaturization. The new 10-centimeter wavelength sets on American destroyers could spot a periscope head from miles away, even against rough seas. The old cat-and-mouse arrangement shifted. The cat finally had sonar and wings. British developed Lee lights, fitted on patrol bombers, illuminated submarines caught on the surface after dark. Each sweep of white light was a death sentence that arrived without warning. Meanwhile, American production overwhelmed arithmetic. Liberty ships launched faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink them, 3 a day by 1943. These vessels were crude, square-prowed, built from prefabricated sections welded rather than riveted. But their simplicity masked strength, a strategic embodiment of democracy's manufacturing power. Marshal Dönitz, the U-boat's architect, later observed, "Their shipyards were yards of victory." He was not wrong. By spring 1943, each convoy crossing the Atlantic became a proof of concept for total coordination. Radio discipline was impeccable. Sonar operators had months of combat practice. Escort commanders shared information instantly across national lines. Royal Navy, U.S. Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, communicating in standardized signals born from shared peril. Industrial mass met Allied unity, something Germany's exhausted allies could not replicate. Every statistic underscored the pressure mounting against Donitz. Between January and May 1943 alone, 169 U-boats were destroyed. In May, the losses became unbearable. It was during those weeks that German crews began calling it Black May. For the first time, they were dying faster than they could be trained or commissioned. Convoys ONS-5 and HX-237 survived massive pack attacks with minimal losses while destroying over a dozen submarines. German propaganda could no longer conceal it. Atlantic Schlacht, the Battle of the Atlantic, was being lost not by might of gun, but by evolution of coordination. Still, the collapse of an enemy is rarely visible from within a single night. It unfolded gradually, ship by ship, frequency by frequency. Each uneventful voyage, each moment when radar detected nothing, sonar pinged nothing, and daylight revealed another entire line of merchant wakes reaching the horizon, was the miracle that slowly hardened into expectation. The impossibility had become procedure. The Germans, who once joked that Allied convoys were floating classrooms, now discovered that their jokes had become obituaries. Within months, fear at sea reversed its current. U-boat captains would soon dread the silence that hid listening destroyers and escort carriers prowling in patient rings. By mid-1943, the statistics of the Atlantic War could be read like pulse lines, and from every instrument, the heart of U-boat supremacy was flatlining. To understand how the Allies achieved this transformation, historians separate the story into intertwined angles: tactical, technological, human, and psychological. Each reveals a facet of the same revelation: that American organization, applied with industrial precision, can turn repetition itself into a weapon. Every convoy was a moving fortress bound not by walls, but by rhythm. At the center, merchant ships steamed at an identical 9 knots, their captains trained to hold formation no matter what chaos erupted nearby. On the perimeter circled destroyers and corvettes, sometimes a dozen or more, creating an acoustic and visual barrier. Depth charges were not fired blindly. They were set in patterns predicted by mathematicians, translating sonar echoes into geometry. After each crossing, commanders convened post-sail reviews, dissecting every anomaly, every false contact, until error gave way to instinct. U.S. escorts learned to fight by data, not superstition. When U-boats attacked in pack formations, the convoy no longer scattered, a fatal tradition of 1940, but tightened, letting escorts converge fire while radiomen passed bearings across the screen. The procedure looked mechanical, but within its logic lived the future of modern naval warfare: control outlasting fear. By the time German lookouts sighted a convoy on the horizon, it had already seen them hours earlier. Allied radar, operating on centimeter wavelengths, defied camouflage. Tests aboard the destroyer USS Borley demonstrated that even a periscope's glint could betray a submarine 10 miles distant. To counter this, German crews fitted rubber coatings and snorkels, but each adaptation arrived too late. Above the ocean, aircraft from escort carriers turned scouting into constant surveillance. Beneath it, the sonar of S-class destroyers penetrated to depths where torpedo men once hid in safety. Out of these instruments came a new confidence: machines as extensions of vigilance. American shipyards spared no resource. Farm boys turned radar technicians overnight. and each Liberty ship left port not only with cargo, but with code books showing how to jam or mask radio frequencies. Technology no longer innovated in isolation. It worked in chorus, just as the convoy itself moved in rhythm. Invisible above both fleets was a third combatant: intelligence. Every German message traveled through the same illusion of secrecy, the Enigma cipher. At Bletchley Park, British cryptologists had already pried open Enigma's patterns, but the integration of U.S. naval communications expanded speed and accuracy. Decoded coordinates reached Allied command in hours rather than days, giving convoys elastic foresight. A U-boat warned of enemy presence would often surface into heavy escort formations already waiting. To the Germans, these coincidences seemed supernatural. To the Allies, they were arithmetic. Radio operators developed the nickname Miracle Mabel for the faceless analysts rerouting them from danger. No sailor ever saw her, but tens of thousands owed their lives to her unseen calculations. Every convoy combined automation with endurance. Merchant sailors, though civilians, endured conditions rougher than many frontline troops: sub-freezing decks, salt spray freezing to railings, constant steam leaks from overworked engines. The men guarding them were scarcely better off. Naval watch shifts, measured in hours of half-sleep and cigarette embers. Yet, there was a shared conviction that grew with each safe arrival at Liverpool or Halifax. It was not victory's pride, but gratitude. Knowledge that procedure, obedience, and mutual reliance could outlast terror. For these crews, monotony became mercy. Across the Atlantic, families who once dreaded telegrams began to measure time again in predictable arrivals of food and mail. Even predictability was victory. Inside Germany, detached reports replaced triumph lists. Dönitz wrote to his captains, "Success demands faith in the machine, not despair of it." But morale fissured. Veterans who had once toasted new sinkings now looked at weather charts and muttered, "Death patrols." U-boat bases at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire filled with widows and unanswered mail. The silence of the sea, once their ally, had turned untrustworthy. Crews began to hear phantom pings from sonar that wasn't there, to see false shadows of destroyers in the fog. Even when a U-boat attacked successfully, odds of returning home sank below chance. Technology, industry, and patience, America's holy trinity of warfare, had undone the legend of the Grey Wolf Pack. Yet, as decisive as these factors were, the story was not merely one of machines or tactics. It was a mosaic of characters and choices. Commanders who believed the ocean invincible would soon watch its balance disintegrate inside the final months of 1943, a turning point history would later call the longest battle's shortest. Spring. All wars hinge on leadership, but few theaters demanded so much coordination between allies as the Atlantic. By 1943, the personalities steering strategy were as influential as any weapon. In Washington, Admiral Ernest J. King, austere and uncompromising, integrated U.S. Navy operations with British command while insisting on centralized American control of anti-submarine warfare. Across the Atlantic, Admiral Sir Max Horton directed Western Approach's headquarters from Liverpool, orchestrating escorts, merchant routes, and coastal command sorties with cold precision. Their alliance, prickly, pragmatic, embodied the broader union between two nations that had been strangers in peace. Officers learned each other's temperaments as well as signals procedures. Above all, these men understood that logistics was strategy. Without fuel, no army moves. Without convoys, no fuel. That comprehension produced stubborn continuity from top to bottom of the chain. Even amid catastrophic losses early in 1943, no senior figure proposed withdrawal. They sensed that patience and science favored them, and history would prove them correct. Beneath every technical victory lay a campaign for morale. U.S. Navy psychologists, part of the relatively new Bureau of Medicine and Surgery's research unit, studied fatigue among sonar operators. Simple innovations, better lighting, rotation schedules, vitamin enrichment, extended alertness by measurable degrees. A rested crew detected more submarines, and each detection meant lives saved. It was proof that the war of nerves could be planned as systematically as a radar installation. For the enemy, morale disintegrated in mirror image. Kriegsmarine sensors began redacting letters that mentioned sinking noises around us, or endless depth charges. Survivors described an internal surrender long before any surfaced to raise a white flag. Each safe Allied crossing represented the slow suffocation of U-boat spirit. American factories became arsenals of rhythm. At Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast, Liberty ships rolled off lines in 42 days or less. Welders operated in shifts so continuous that sparks blurred into daylight. Men joked that Germany's enigma needed a new setting, one that could decipher how a democracy produced faster than they could destroy. The scale went beyond numbers. It created confidence. When convoy planners learned that replacements would arrive before losses could hurt schedules, operational risk shrank. Industry did more than replenish, it normalized peril. Every captain knew that his ship, no matter how vital, was part of an inexhaustible chain. In contrast, each U-boat was an irreplaceable asset. Each loss a family tragedy calculated in months of training wasted. Industrial multiplication had become strategic anesthesia. Pain could no longer outpace production. For Americans, convoys forged an unfamiliar relationship between civilian freedom and military order. Civilian merchant sailors operated under naval code, and female communications officers, often from the waves and wrens, isolated in coastal huts, routed these ships through statistical precision. The gender boundaries peculiar to both societies bent in favor of survival. Aboard Liberty ships, ordinary men quoted Roosevelt's promise that the sea lanes must remain free without irony. Merchant service transformed democracy from slogan to practice. Across U-boat pens, culture was collapsing inward. Propaganda film crews stopped visiting the docks. What had once been the elite of German arms became absent from newsreels. Prestige gave way to silence, then shame. Captured submariners later offered candid accounts of astonishment rather than hatred. Many spoke admiringly of American efficiency. One recalled, "Their sky was always full of planes, our sea full of scientists." German analysts performed calculations trying to prove Allied success impossible. Too many variables, too many oceans, until evidence refuted logic. By late 1943, Dönitz conceded operational withdrawal from the North Atlantic routes. For the first time since 1939, Britain's food imports matched sustainability levels. America's scarcity resistance, logistical abundance as weapon, had changed not only a battle, but the trajectory of the war's end. What unfolded across the Atlantic was not only a struggle for tonnage, but for conception of civilization. The U-boat campaign embodied organized predation. Destroy the feeder lines of open societies. The convoy system embodied organized cooperation. Protect them. By mid-1943, that principle had produced its own morality. Discipline as safeguard of humanity. Every safe voyage meant bakers in Liverpool, welders in Boston, and partisans in Italy could all partake in the same unseen victory. Industrial democracy had defeated industrial tyranny not by rhetoric, but by functioning better under pressure. This convergence of human and mechanical strength prepared the stage for the exact moment when reversal became undeniable. The violent spring of 1943, when wolf packs collided headlong with escorts that no longer feared them. From those encounters came the realization that the Atlantic, once the Reich's hunting ground, belonged again to the Allies. The North Atlantic, late April 1943. Convoy ONS-5 was 42 ships deep, 60 miles long. crawling west from Liverpool into a weather system that erased horizon and sound alike. For the first time, the Allies were taking the fight outward, crossing waters once dominated by the hunter. The sea was a bruise of slate and spindrift. Wind howled above 30 knots. It was the kind of storm that should have favored the submarines, hiding them under confusion. Instead, it became their ruin. Dönitz had ordered 56 U-boats to intercept, a massed wolf pack named Star, with branches Meise, Specht, and Amsel stretching across the mid-Atlantic. For a week they maneuvered by radio, homing on the faint signals of merchant propellers. Each hour, another contact blurred into the static. Unknown to the Germans, every transmission they sent to one another was being decrypted and relayed within hours to Western Approach's command. At dawn on May 4th, destroyer HMS Duncan turned sharply east, depth charges blasting in rhythmic intervals. Below, U-638 burst upward through debris and oil like a dying fish. 2 more U-boats followed within 24 hours. Aboard the American destroyer USS Moving Star, sonar operators logged over 50 contacts that night, each evaluated, prioritized, attacked, or dismissed. What seemed chaos to German officers watching through periscopes was orchestration. An entire escort screen communicating by radar and voice circuits, triangulating without delay. When U-125 breached the surface, its deck gun iced over. British corvette Snowflake rammed it, slicing through conning tower and crew. Storm waves finished what steel began. Days later, the Royal Navy's war diary would note dryly, Convoy ONS-5 arrived Halifax. 1 escort lost, 13 U-boats sunk or crippled. It was the pivot. Not propaganda, not guessing. Hard numbers proving that advantage had inverted. After ONS-5, Dönitz withdrew the entire pack from that sector. He called it temporary retraining. In truth, it was retreat. His cipher orders that week revealed fatigue behind the precision. Abort attacks when risk outweighs opportunity. In strategic terms, he had surrendered the North Atlantic for the first time since 1939. Meanwhile, U.S. convoy HX-237, following days behind, crossed the same coordinates. Every escort carried radar, every pilot lee lights. They lost 2 merchantmen to torpedoes. 7 submarines never returned to port. Kriegsmarine radio traffic shrank to near silence. Fleet headquarters interpreted the stillness as communications failure, not destruction. Only later, when patrol grids reported missing boats, did disbelief set in. The commander of U-659 wrote before departing on what became his last mission. They wait for us, these Americans. We are hunted by patience itself. In practical terms, these paired battles, ONS-5 and HX-237, disproved the U-boat doctrine. The ocean that once punished complexity now rewarded it. The meticulous convoy formations, once derided by impatient captains as floating classrooms, had survived a full offensive unbroken. For sailors who endured the first years of slaughter, it was liberation disguised as monotony. No ships lost meant the method worked. The miracle had logic now. Photographs taken at Halifax show returning merchant crews grinning around blankets of steam and cigarette smoke. No medals awaited them, only dockside workers unloading food for a continent that could eat again. Behind each crate of meat or grain stood the invisible grave of a sunk U-boat, a quiet tally of reversed fate. From that month onward, every convoy that crossed without loss became more than logistics. It was declaration. The Atlantic was no longer Germany's sea. The following weeks confirmed what history would later record as irreversible change. Between May and July 1943, Atlantic warfare reached its mathematical truth. The more the Allies refined procedure, the less opportunity the enemy possessed. Each element, radar, escort carriers, air coordination, encrypted routing, functioned now as a complete flexing organism. For German crews, survival itself became statistical anomaly. Reports from Lorient, La Rochelle, and Bergen described returning boats covered in salt crust and silence. Captains who had once disembarked to brass music now stepped onto deserted piers. Mechanics counted torpedo scars and shrapnel holes, whispering of unseen destroyers emerging from fog. At sea, the pattern repeated daily. A detected transmission, a cloud of depth-charge plumes, an oil slick widening across gray swells. The hunters no longer saw their enemy, only the consequences of sonar precision. At the same time, skies overhead transformed from occasional patrol zones to armed sealing. The arrival of long-range B-24 Liberators, equipped with centimetric radar and the blinding power of Lee lights, erased what little sanctuary submarines had retained. During one patrol from Northern Ireland, a single aircraft located 3 U-boats in a single sortie. 2 were destroyed outright. The third limped home crippled. Pilots began calling the mid-Atlantic gap the Corridor of Ghosts, because all signals that entered it now vanished. It was not bravado, it was arithmetic. Inside German naval headquarters at Kurneval, Admiral Dönitz lifted a coded paper during a staff evening in June 1943. 41 U-boats lost in 1 month. He stared at the number for several seconds before speaking. The transcript later recalled his only comment. "We are fighting the Atlantic itself, and it no longer belongs to man." He ordered operational withdrawal west of 20 degrees longitude and instructed surviving captains to avoid contact except under exceptional conditions. That phrase, vague yet final, signaled the end of unrestricted U-boat war. To Allied sailors, victory manifested strangely, in silence. No alarms, no sudden detonations, simply voyages that completed without note. For commanders like Commodore Donald McIntyre of the Royal Navy, that absence of drama proved the system had matured. Convoys functioned as industrial process rather than adventure. Departure, escort rotation, mid-ocean signal check, arrival. War distilled into routine. The measure of triumph was that nothing happened. Yet even amid this calm, loss remained personal. Hundreds of bodies from earlier years still rolled with tides or lay entombed in cargo holds of ships resting spine-broken on the continental shelf. Each successful crossing carried the memory of failure beneath its hull. American escorts often held small night services. A minute of silence as the convoy passed coordinates known for mass graves. The tone was not celebration, but acceptance. In mechanical war, morality resided in perseverance. When historians later compared casualty records, they discovered the numerical pivot had happened in exactly 28 days, from mid-April to mid-May 1943. In that span, Allied tonnage lost per U-boat sunk leapt from 25,000 tons to barely 7,000. The enemy's combat efficiency collapsed by 2/3. From that curve downward, reversal never ceased. No subsequent campaign of the Kriegsmarine would recover parity. The significance was elemental. For the first time, the logistical artery feeding the liberation of Europe beat faster than the enemy could cut it. In July, Operation Torch convoys sailed freely toward North Africa with negligible interference. In August, the first fully protected Arctic supply route reached Murmansk without loss, ice replacing torpedoes as the main threat. And by September, planning boards in London dared to draft timelines for a continental invasion. Their calculations assumed one unbroken premise: the Atlantic Highway was open. Hundreds of miles away, in a half-flooded U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire, welders dismantled rusted towers as pigeons nested where crews once stood to salute. Soon, the dry docks would be abandoned altogether. To the Allied sailor steaming past the Bay of Biscay, the future looked clear, not peaceful yet, but navigable. The longest battle in modern history had turned in less than a month, and with it shifted the gravity of the entire war. Ahead lay aftermath, industry's accounting of victory, the slow embering of a navy built for ambush, now facing starvation. In that stillness, a new world order prepared to cross the ocean the other way. By the autumn of 1943, the Atlantic had changed from a graveyard to a highway. Convoys moved in synchronized columns traced by contrails of destroyers and circling aircraft. For the first time since 1939, Allied officials no longer spoke of tonnage lost, but of tonnage delivered. The statistic mirrored a moral. Risk had become manageable. With every successful crossing, the logistical architecture for invasion solidified. In Washington, the newly created 10th Fleet operated not as a seagoing command, but as a cerebral one, a coordination center of mathematics, signal traffic, and anti-submarine intelligence. Groups of naval officers, academics, and corporate engineers met in air-conditioned offices rather than on decks, calculating convoy spacing, fuel distribution, and aircraft endurance. Charts now showed ocean squares with probabilities rather than guesses. The enemy remained dangerous but predictable, a phenomenon military science could model and therefore control. The effects rippled backward through industry. Shipyards that had once built vessels simply to replace losses began planning expansion for assault fleets, landing craft, tank carriers, floating dry docks. The tone in production reports shifted from desperation to tempo. How quickly victory could be supplied with steel. At Kaiser's Richmond facility, Liberty Ship number 2000 slid into San Francisco Bay, under banner, "Your cargo will free Europe." Logistics had absorbed romance. Meanwhile, in Europe's shadow, the defeated predators retreated home. At ports from Brest to Kiel, crews returned thin, hollow-eyed, and half-deaf from months of sonar detonations. Each surviving U-boat bore scars like infection, buckled plating, ruptured fuel tanks, radar-burnt paint. Scrapping yards struggled to handle the wrecks. Those not dismantled were cannibalized for spare parts, their diesel engines repurposed to power generators for coastal towns that barely functioned. The very machines that had sought to strangle civilization now kept lights on in ruins. Prisoners interrogated by Allied naval intelligence described disbelief, not hatred. One strong theme repeated in transcripts: the enemy's precision was inhuman. "I felt," one officer admitted, "that we fought a mechanical tide." He referred not only to the machinery, but to the moral steadiness behind it. No gloating transmissions, no theatrical cruelty, merely an unbroken tempo of organization, the same pragmatism that built grocery lines, schools, and highways in peacetime had simply been exported to the ocean. The cost for the Allies, however, still carried weight. Over 36,000 merchant seamen were lost during the battle, civilians with no uniforms, many with no graves. For every unscathed convoy, another lay rusting miles below, weighed down by forgotten cargo. Admiral Horton, writing privately, described victory as a burden of ghosts. Even American sailors known for gum-chewing insouciance developed rituals, throwing a single coffee ration overboard before each voyage in honor of those still out there. On the strategic level, the conclusion of the Atlantic War refocused every Allied resource toward the European mainland. Logistics officers calculated the steady rhythm of deliverables that would later make Operation Overlord plausible. 100 ships per week, 500,000 tons of materiel monthly, every item traceable back to ports once terrorized by submarines. In the planning memoranda for D-Day, there is a short line handwritten by an anonymous staffer: "Because convoys will arrive." That understatement enclosed 4 years of fear and invention. Politically, the moral triumph mattered as deeply as the material one. The U.S. public, largely unaware of the battle's scale, began seeing propaganda posters celebrating the merchant navy. Radio correspondents described the convoys not as adventures, but as proof of democratic endurance. For a war-fatigued population, The image reassured, disciplined teamwork, not divine intervention, wins wars. For the Germans, the reversal prompted reorganization and futility in equal measure. Design teams hurried to perfect revolutionary models like the Type 21 electric U-boat, promising greater submersion time and higher speed. But progress moved slower than Allied patrols. Factories bombed, morale broken, and resources starved. Those blueprints became epitaphs for an era of vanished mastery. By the time prototypes touched water, radar and sonar had already outgrown them. Throughout late 1943, Allied headquarters marked maritime routes on maps not as danger zones, but as arteries. To Britain, to North Africa, to Sicily, eventually to Normandy. Each line recalled where sonar had once echoed with death. Now it pulsed with convoy schedules like heartbeat signatures. The Atlantic's transformation from terror corridor to highway of liberation stood as both technological feat and moral symbol. It promised new beginnings, but left uncounted consequences still rippling under gray North Atlantic waves. When autumn 1944 arrived, the Atlantic had become so secure that the war's youngest generation of sailors barely understood what their predecessors had endured. Convoy duty, once synonymous with terror, was reclassified as routine service. Destroyer crews drilled for maintenance instead of survival. Escort carriers trained largely for amphibious operations. To them, the Wolf Pack was already legend, its threat reduced to cautionary tales retold between shifts in the engine room. U.S. and British command converted triumph into process. Each voyage that reached its destination became an audited line item. Cargo type, fuel burned, radar contacts, ocean conditions. A legacy echoed in the bureaucratic discipline of post-war logistics. The same system that had coordinated freighters and destroyers under fire soon managed reconstruction. UNRWA relief cargoes, Marshall Plan shipments, tankers carrying oil into a revived Europe. Victory thus dissolved seamlessly into administration, proving how organization was both sword and scaffold of democracy. For the Germans, the reckoning was intimate and public. Of the 39,000 men who had served in the U-Bootwaffe, roughly 27,000 were dead. Proportionally, the most lethal assignment of any branch in any service during the war. In post-war memoirs, surviving commanders would never describe their downfall as defeat by numbers. They called it Erstickung, suffocation, an asphyxiation of opportunity by an enemy that learned faster than they could adapt. Theirs was a modern tragedy, skill eclipsed by system. In Allied ports, the symbolism endured beyond the statistics. Liverpool docks filled once again with milk, sugar, and fruit. Cargomen swapped rations for real meals, sometimes still glancing at the horizon expecting the flash of a periscope. At New York's piers, hundreds of Liberty ships anchored side by side, hulls streaked with rust, but dignified in purpose. Dock workers joked that America had built a floating city larger than the enemy's entire fleet. They were not wrong. Production had outlived the reasons for it, continuing like breath after sprint. Above them all hung one unspoken memory: the sound of safety. For sailors who had lived through the worst years, silence on the sonar scope was no longer empty. It was sacred. They understood that absence of fear was not natural, but earned. In harbor taverns, veterans would mimic the sonar ping in jest, a private badge of survival. Their humor, brittle and proud, masked grief for comrades whose names never crossed home radio waves. The U.S. Navy later printed a single-line epitaph on memorial programs: "They charted lanes the world still follows." Strategically, the continental dimensions of victory became visible only after 1945. The success over the U-boat arm meant the Allied war machine could operate as one continuous organism from American steelworks to British airfields, then beyond to continental Europe. Without the secure Atlantic, D-Day's 6,000 ships could never have departed. Without the convoy's practice of coordination, the improvised armada could never have landed soldiers with such speed. The quiet nights of 1943 therefore underwrote the noisy dawn of June 6, 1944. Economically, the maritime routes laid the foundation for the modern world. In 1946, the same squadrons that had guarded convoys escorted refugee liners. Former Liberty ships became civilian freighters in the first boom of globalized commerce. Even the language of coordination, lane, shipping stream, escort group, migrated into post-war industries of trade and aviation. What had once been wartime necessity shaped the arteries of peace. For historians, the Battle of the Atlantic remains both invisible and foundational. It lacked the cinematic horizon of Normandy or the atomic brightness of Hiroshima, yet it decided whether those events could happen at all. It is, paradoxically, a story of nothing happening. The victory of safe arrivals, quiet docks, and regular supply chains. Every silence on the North Atlantic in 1944 echoed the roar of industrial order matured into art. By the time Japan surrendered, the ocean that had once devoured convoys carried Liberty ships under full lights with radios unjammed. Their decks crowded with returning servicemen gazing at the same stars that once hid submarines. No cheers marked the crossings. The war's exhaustion allowed only a slow exhalation. Peace had no fireworks yet. Only that steady mechanical heartbeat of engines running east and west with unbroken rhythm. Thus, the Atlantic, cleansed by storm and human persistence, became what it had been before empires armed it. Pathway, not prison. Bridge, not barrier. Its sound was the pulse of modern civilization, and its silence the proof that endurance can outlast fear. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a single explosion or surrender ceremony. It ended with an absence, an ocean suddenly quiet where terror used to live. The silence of safe convoys became democracy's most practical victory, accomplished not by rhetoric, but by the relentless discipline of coordination. What began as desperation evolved into a demonstration of order as power. America's shipyards and Britain's endurance proved that freedom could organize itself with greater precision than tyranny could command. Every Liberty ship welded, every sonar pulse that returned clean, every convoy that arrived whole was a vote for stability over chaos. The ocean turned classroom, the system itself a lesson. Where ideology preached hierarchy, the Atlantic answered with cooperation. Long after the U-boats rusted in their pens, new generations inherited that rhythm. Each cargo liner, each commercial air route, still echoes the patterns first mapped under fire. Navigation by trust, communication by procedure, progress through patience. In the mechanical hum of engines crossing between continents, one can still hear the pulse of that wartime convoy. Steady, democratic, and brave in its normalcy. Because in the end, victory at sea was never about domination. It was about restoring the ordinary. The chance for ships loaded with bread instead of bullets to reach another shore unafraid. And that, more than any banner or bomb, was how freedom proved itself unsinkable.